Right on. Thanks, Dan. So, white-tailed deer are a type of animal known as ruminants. And basically, ruminants are deer, antelope, cows, a bunch of animals that get by browsing on really poor quality feed, vegetative matter, and deer specifically are ruminants that are called concentrate selectors. So that's as opposed to more generalist feeding pattern. Deer have a very prehensile snout, slender. They can get into the vegetation, really not only pick out the plants that they want, but also the parts of the plants that they want, and leave the other stuff behind. Um, Deer need to eat about 6 to 8% of their body weight daily, which doesn't sound like a ton, but when you think about a 150-pound deer eating 9 pounds of food in a day, that is a ton. But that's how much it takes when you're eating that poor quality forage to kind of sustain yourself out there in the Illinois landscape. Now, here's a little breakdown of the digestion. So, this is an antelope, but deer are the same. Ruminants all have the same basic structure. And basically, once they eat food, it goes into this enlarged portion of the stomach called the rumen. And in the rumen, a lot of fermentation. It's called foregut fermentation because it's the beginning part of the gut. This is what helps them to extract the most amount of nutrients they can out of this poor quality forage. So they've got a whole microbiome going on in this rumen that's fermentating and allowing them to absorb more nutrients from the stuff they eat. Then they can cough that stuff back up and re-chew it, and then it goes through the rest of their digestive system, and the whole time the body is trying to pull nutrients and also salts and water out of all the stuff they ate. The cecum especially in ruminants is enlarged. There's more fermentation that happens there, but this is a place that exists to try to trap all the water and salts that exist in the food that these animals eat. So a lot of times they can get by and get all the hydration they need just from eating the food that they eat without drinking free water. And of course, this re-chewing of the food, this is what's called the cud. And this is important for animals like deer because they're small enough and tasty enough that a lot of stuff eat them. They need to go to these specialized foraging locations and get as much food as possible and then retreat to cover where they can fully process that, cough it up, chew it again in the safety of cover, because basically when they're feeding is when they're probably at their highest chance of predation, both from natural predators and probably from human hunters as well. So, where does this exist in a deer? Well, it's right there in that circle. This is where we do not want to shoot. This is the no arrow zone when you're archery hunting. You want to hopefully get all of your arrows in front of that arrow, but behind the front shoulder. If you do that, you're putting them through the double lungs, and hey, that's the best we can do. Now, a little bit beyond their digestive system, here's where it starts, their teeth. So because deer are eating all this herbaceous diet and browsing on vines and buds and all these kinds of things, their teeth tend to wear in a very constant pattern. Since they do that, you can age animals like deer just by looking at their tooth wear. This doesn't really work with carnivores or animals that eat a lot of different things like that, but with strictly herbivores, it works really well to a certain extent. And here's just a little bit of terminology when it comes to the tooth when you're looking into aging them that you'll see the lingual crest, the cusps, each of those little bumps there that you think looks like a tooth from the top. Some of them are a single tooth that are connected. Those are called cusps. And so in deer, we've got the 3 premolars and then the 3 molars that are beyond that space. They actually do have incisors, which are beyond this picture, but deer have 6 incisors on the bottom, 0 on the top. And here's a handy little chart that kind of shows us how we can age them. And this is really the easiest when it comes to fawn, yearling, or 2.5-year-old. Now you can certainly age them beyond that, but the further you get beyond 2.5 years old, the basically tougher it is to judge them just by tooth wear. That's where a method called cementum annuli aging would come in handy, and you can do that with the incisors. They slice a little cross section and you count the rings like a tree. They have fast periods of growth and slow periods of growth, and they can be counted just like that. But in terms of just judging by the tooth wear, look at this fawn here. This is real easy because the molars have not come up yet. So we've got 1, 2, 3 on the premolars, but we've only got that first molar, and the second, the one they're calling number 5, is just emerging. Now the yearling, which would be the 1.5-year-old deer, now he's got all 6 of those teeth have emerged. So premolars 1, 2, 3, and molars 4, 5, 6. But look at premolar number 3. He's got 3 cusps on him. 1, 2, 3. That means that is that natal premolar. So that premolar is going to be lost. And if you go to the 2.5-year-old deer, now if you count premolar 1, 2, 3, oh, look, he's only got 2 cusps. So smaller tooth in the adult deer, and that's the way it'll be for the rest of that deer's life. And then 3.5, you see just more dentine. And then as you go older and older, more and more of that dentine is going to be exposed until those teeth become almost flat. And eventually they'll be wore down to the jaw, and at that point a lot of animals die a dental death. They can no longer eat. And that's probably somewhere around 9, 10, 11 years old with deer. Their teeth just don't last much longer than that. Now, very few of them make it past even 3.5 years old, so we don't get a ton of them that old, but it has happened on occasion. Now, we looked at our friends' webpage, the National Deer Association. They've got some awesome resources for deer. Definitely encourage you to check them out. Here's an article that a guy by the name of Matt Ross wrote, What Do Deer Eat? A Deer Diet Breakdown by Season, and we borrowed this here, a graph from that, and it's really cool. So this is not Illinois or the Midwest specific at all. This was average findings from more than 50 studies. So this could definitely be a little bit different in the Midwest, but it does give us a good snapshot of what deer eat in general. And to break these categories down a little bit, like I say, you see browse makes up a good portion of that. Well, what are browse? Browse is trees, shrubs, briars, and vines. So it's not just deer nibbling on buds or eating on trees. It actually includes shrubs, briars, and vines as well. Forbs are going to be basically anything that you would call weeds or broad-leafed plants that aren't woody. Mast is going to be your acorns, berries, apples, crab apples, anything of that nature. Crops, everybody knows that. See, here in Illinois, our crop percentage would probably be a little bit higher than what's shown here, but remember, this is an average of 50 studies that happened all over North America, so not necessarily right around here in the grain belt. Then we see grass, and then we see lichens and fungus, which make up a small portion of the diet, but it is present, ever present, just a very small portion. So pretty interesting stuff there from NDA. Now, to go into that a little step further, why are they selecting what they're selecting? So we know deer are called concentrate selector ruminants. They're selecting certain plants. Well, here's why. They looked at the protein content among forbs, briars, shrubs, and trees. So all 3 of those last things would be considered browse. and they looked at both the young vegetative matter and old vegetative matter, and you see that nutrient contents does differ between those. And it's not always the young that's highest. The young is generally highest in crude protein, but you see these other lines are potassium, calcium, and phosphorus. Some of these, especially calcium, does tend to go up as the vegetative matter ages. So deer can kind of fine tune and select, and that same all those same heightened senses that make them incredibly difficult to hunt actually help them to forage. They're really good at tasting vegetative matter and almost judging the nutrition content of that matter and any amount of toxins before they eat it. They've got a prehensile tongue that can reach out and grab exactly what they want to eat and suck it in. So one kind of cool project from Oklahoma found that even though deer eat literally hundreds of species of plants, only about 1/3 of those plants account for 93% of the deer's diet. So, yes, they will eat everything, but there's probably about 25 to 30% of the plants out there that are extra good deer forage, and we're going to be looking at those a little bit further in the rest of this. But in general, those plants that the deer are seeking out are the plants that give them the best return on investment. So the amount of nutrients that they need, and you got to figure how good is the getting, because it's great if they find a food source that is full of carbohydrates, full of fats, but if it's only spitting out one fruit or one nut every week or so, that's obviously not going to be an important food source for your deer herd because it's just not enough there to sustain many critters. So pretty cool stuff. Now here is, believe it or not, there's not a ton of studies that have actually looked through rumen contents and identified all the stuff that's in there. So when it comes to what are deer actually eating, a lot of it is field observations and going and looking to see what's being browsed. But I did find one where they actually did collect hundreds of deer rumens and they counted what's in there. So these are things that we know deer ate. Now note that this was not in Illinois. This here was in Ohio, so not that far away. Similar circumstances going on there, but these are in decreasing order of occurrence. Wild crabapple, and that might be the vegetative matter and also obviously the fruits, corn, sumac seeds and stems, Japanese honeysuckle leaves and stems, grasses, greenbrier fruits and leaves, clover, soybeans, leaves and beans, jewelweed leaves, acorns, and dogwood drupes and stems. And of note, Ohio deer were not heavily dependent on woody browse even in the wintertime. So there was enough food. That's probably similar in Illinois. But if you go up just a state to the north, the Great Lakes states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, deer in those states, definitely in the winter, they're probably resorting to a lot more woody browse. So there could be changes in diet even one state away for sure, but that's what makes pretty cool. Adaptable little critter. And now, enough biology, science nerd. Let's dive into some botany, right? And I just threw this picture in here because it was a cool. Got this back in early September, but it's right when the deer were starting to shed into their winter pelage pattern. So you kind of get a good look at what their summer pelage looks like next to their winter pelage, and they stand out really good in the summer, and then dang, they can get pretty tough to spot once they get into that winter colors. You know what I'm saying? That's what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, especially when they stop moving. In the middle of the
Yeah.
woods, when they're moving, you can pick up on them pretty easily. But once they stop moving, ugh,
Oh, they
it's tough.
disappear. I mean, just look at that one in front of those leaves. It's and that's nothing in the way from probably 10 feet, 12 feet. and still you can see where it could be hard to see. So it's could be tricky out there.
That it can. That it can. All right. So thank you, Curtis. Now we're going to kind of talk about some of the species, how to identify them. And specifically kind of what we look for, right? And so I'm going to take a quick just run through. I should have put this slide earlier, but I just really want to emphasize the importance of why we talk so much about food and about bedding. And if you've taken our workshops or listened to our podcast or other webinars, you've heard us really focus very heavily on the bedding aspect. And now we're going to, like Curtis said, really focus on this feeding aspect. And a lot of it really comes down to this very simplified deer hunting equation that we're all trying to basically put together and identify. And that's finding point A. So where are these deer starting? That's your bedding area. Where are they going? Point B, that's going to be your feeding area. And what we really want to emphasize as we kind of go through this picture or through this webinar is a lot of people, when they think of feeding area, they think of a food plot. And in reality, I think the hunting community and especially the hunting industry has done almost a disservice to a lot of hunters, and a lot of hunters don't really understand this concept of browsing, and that's kind of why Curtis really dove into that biology there. And so now we're just going to kind of transition and talk about a lot of these species that are A, fairly abundant on the landscape, that are B, pretty easy for us as hunters to identify. Again, I'm not asking everybody to be a botanist or go through a dichotomous key and really key out species, but these are plants that are pretty easy to pinpoint once you know what to look for. And three, where are the deer using them and where are these plants found in the landscape? Because when I get to a new area and if I don't see big open areas that look like, again, I hunt public land. And so a lot of times I don't see areas that are ag. There may be ag surrounding the entire property, but a lot of times on the public land, there may not be a ton of ag. And so if you're not familiar with these other food sources, you may just completely not know where to start. And so that's kind of where we're going to dive today. But we'll first start off with crabapple. So crabapple is a tree that Curtis brought up in his little introduction there, and it was actually listed first. So this is a species that gets a lot of attention from deer. Now, this is a tree that most people are probably familiar with, maybe not necessarily out in the landscape when you're out hunting, but it's something that's planted fairly regularly ornamentally, whether it's in urban parks, even in some. I have some in my neighborhood that the city planted, so it's a fairly common tree that you'll see, and it's pretty small to mid-sized tree. But I do want to emphasize there are a few species that are native to Illinois. Now, we're not going to go through each species. We're really just going to detail crabapple and kind of use that as a collective term for lack of a better example. But what I want to emphasize specifically about crabapple is it really prefers more open areas. And so it's a tree that a lot of people will call shade intolerant, meaning it doesn't like shade. It needs a lot of sunlight. It needs what you'll note here is we call disturbance. And so a lot of times if you were to go into a forest and clear that out and basically reopen that canopy and allow the sunlight to really penetrate and hit that forest floor, that's a lot of times what we're calling disturbance, where we're kind of resetting the natural succession of a timber stand, of a woodland, of a prairie, that kind of thing. So that's when we use the term disturbance, that's really what we're getting at, is that it needs light and it needs a lot of light. And so oftentimes you're going to find this tree on the edges of pastures and fields. You may even find it in prairies. We were out at a workshop about 2 weeks ago for a deer workshop out at Des Plaines State Fish and Wildlife Area. And we were just kind of walking around during the scouting and trying to find some bedding and stuff. And we found several really nice crabapple trees in the middle of that prairie that you could tell deer were actively feeding under. There was a lot of scat around. There's a lot of nipped off vegetation where you could see they were eating off the fruit, eating off those berries. So a really good one to keep an eye out for, and pretty easy to identify. As you can see here in this picture in the middle that I'm kind of circling, it can have very white flowers and it can also have these pink flowers. Now, this is related to our apple trees. So apple trees are in the genus Malus, and this is a member of that tree. So it looks very typical like your standard apple tree. And these are the red fruits that it produces. Really good tree to keep an eye out for. Up next is sumac. So this is one of these trees I like because I call it my 60 mile per hour tree. This is one of those that once your brain determines and develops a specific search image, you will be able to see these going down the interstate at 60 miles an hour and be able to pin, yep, that's a sumac, that's a sumac, that's a sumac. Just like the crabapple, we're going to use the term sumac kind of collectively today, as there are several species that are native to Illinois. The most common are going to be smooth sumac, staghorn sumac, there's a royal sumac, and then a winged sumac. And there are a couple other sumacs in there, but these are kind of the most abundant in Illinois. I like to kind of view it more of a shrub than a tree. And if you look at this picture here on the bottom right, we've probably all seen these along the interstate. This big tuft of red-looking seed. You can't really tell if they're flowers, berries, seeds, whatever they are, but they just kind of create this conical, almost flame-like structure at the top of the plant. So that is, again, sumac. Really common, again, in disturbed areas. So it really likes that open canopy. It's fairly shade intolerant, so it doesn't like a lot of shade. And so you're going to find it in more open areas. I do want to emphasize, a lot of people think this is related to poison sumac. In fact, poison sumac is more closely related to poison ivy than to any of these sumac species. So just kind of keep that in mind. But again, this is a great plant that you're going to see a lot on the Illinois landscape. And next time you're driving down the interstate, especially this time of year when things are starting to really turn red, sumac leaves are one of those things that start to turn yellow and red fairly quick, and a lot of times even more so than some of our other plant species. So it's pretty easy to spot in that sense. Fun little factoid, historically people have used the fruit from this plant to make a tea or a lemonade style drink. I've never personally done it, but I've heard a lot of people like to do that and have fun with that. So definitely look into it if you're interested. But this is sumac, and you're going to see this in a lot of, again, more open, frequently disturbed areas. Up next is Japanese honeysuckle. So just like its name says, it is not native to Illinois. So this is native to East Asia, and it was introduced, like many of our what we consider invasive and exotic plants today. It was introduced for a specific purpose, and then just has over time become very established to the point that it takes over a lot of our areas, and to the point that it's basically what a lot of people call naturalized. It's here now. It's going to be. We will never get rid of it. Basically, it's a losing battle. But this is Japanese honeysuckle. Now, this is more of a vine than what a lot of people are familiar with. Is bush honeysuckle. That's kind of what you see on a lot of Illinois these days. Is this shrubby like bush honeysuckle? It has a very bright red berry as opposed to these purplish berries. The Japanese honeysuckle is by far more preferred food source for deer and vast majority of wildlife than the two species of bush honeysuckle. So again, this one's really easy to spot. It's just a vining type plant that you're going to see. It can like disturbed areas. It's fairly shade tolerant. It can be in shaded areas, although again, it does prefer disturbance. But the easiest way to identify it is in the spring when you see these nice honeysuckle flowers. And once you see those, you'll start picking up on what the vine itself looks like, and you'll be able to spot it pretty quickly. Another vine that most people are probably familiar with is greenbrier. So again, just like the other examples, we're using greenbrier as a very collective term. There is dozens of different species of greenbrier found in the Midwest. But what I want to emphasize about greenbrier is we've probably all been walking through, some kind of thickets, and your legs get tangled in these vines, and then all those vines have prickers and thorns all over them. Usually that's going to be greenbrier. It's pretty much found throughout the entire state. And like I mentioned, there is a ton of different species. Some of those species are very woodland interior. Some of those species are very much more open areas. And so you can pretty much find this in a diverse array of habitat conditions. So, but one dead giveaway about greenbriers, again, it's a vine, so you can see kind of what it looks like structured here. But one really important giveaway is look at the coloration of this leaf. And I know you're probably like, okay, it looks like a green leaf, but in person, this is a different green because that leaf is a lot thicker. And so you can kind of see in some of these leaves down here, but this is a very robust leaf. So it's not like your typical maple leaf that you feel like you can almost, look through. It is a very thick, very robust leaf, and they very commonly have this really dark, kind of shiny look to the leaf. So it's a very shiny, very reflective leaf that again is very thick. And you're going to see this in a bunch of different habitats. And there are some species that the leaves look a little bit different, where the leaves themselves will actually have some kind of spines or thorns on the leaves too. But just keep an eye out for those, because they're a little extra prickly. But this is by far one of the deer's favorite browses. Anytime I'm in a deer stand and I have greenbrier near me, I get a little excited, because the amount of times I've seen deer browse on greenbrier is hard to comprehend. They seem to really favor it. And when you see deer browse, very often they're not going for, like, let's look at this graphic up here. They're not going for this really thick old stem, right? That's not really what they want. What they really want are these tender new shoots that are basically that year's growth. That's very commonly what you're going to see is just nipped off at the tip, is those new growth at the end of what we call on a vine a runner. So a vine continues to grow, it continues to run, it sends out new little tentacle like runners to try to grab a hold of things, and then it'll start producing another vine off of that. That's what the deer are really focused on. And so anytime I'm out scouting and I happen to see greenbrier, I just take a quick glance at it. Do I see a lot of those tips nipped off? Have they been eaten off, or are those tender, new growth, is that still present on that plant? And if it's not, then chances are those deer are in there feeding fairly actively, because they've consumed some of it already. So it's, again, another good piece of sign that just gives you that much more information. Here's another one I won't spend too much time on, because I think most people are probably familiar with clover. We do have native species of clover. A lot of our what people call tick trefoil. You've probably heard the term beggar's lice when you're walking through the woods and you get all these little sticky seeds on you. A lot of times those are from a desmodium species, which is actually related to a clover and is in the clover family. So we're kind of lumping all of those together. So anything that looks like it has three leaves like this, we're essentially calling clover for this conversation. So again, we do have native and we have non-native. A lot of times the non-native are going to be used in more agricultural settings. So there's been a big push. Obviously, if you're not familiar with clover or legumes in general, so clover is a bean. It's in the bean family, and that means it's a nitrogen fixer. So what it does is it pulls all the nitrogen up through the soil or up through the plant, and it releases that nitrogen. So it's really good at increasing the soil quality, to the point that you see a lot of ag producers starting to use clover as their a way to cover crop. And so they can put something over, they seed the clover, let it grow up, and then cut the clover, and then interseed their normal crop after, and it makes that soil a little bit better. You'll also see a lot of these non-native species being used as food plots. So clover has historically been one of the most common food plots used for deer. So when deer hunters have private property and they want to make a food plot, when I first got into hunting in the mid 90s, all the talk was clover. It was clover, alfalfa, which alfalfa is very closely related to clover. Those were really the two big pushes from a lot of the hunting community, the hunting industry. It's changed a little bit these days. People are planting more turnips and things that are a little bit more of a late season food plot option. Just to, again, clover is pretty abundant on the landscape, and so some people are trying different food plot plants. But clover is one you see a lot. And if you're ever out on DNR ground and you're walking around, specifically around a prairie, and it looks like they have mowed paths around that prairie, a lot of times those are going to be what we call fire breaks. And a lot of times you'll see clover being seeded as that fire break vegetation. And so what I mean by that is, let's say they are burning a prairie field. So let's say this is your field, and they don't want the fire to escape in any direction, right? And so they'll basically put a buffer around this entire prairie field that's 10 to 15, sometimes 20 feet in width across, and all this will be planted to a clover. So keep a lookout for that when you're on public sites. That's a fun little way to, like I mentioned, a lot of private landowners spend a lot of money putting in clover food plots. Well, if you're on public land, you may have some clover food plots without even realizing it, and they may just be those fire breaks that are surrounding some of those burn units that they use to prescribe fire. Because the clover is just such a short vegetation, it's going to be fairly green during that burn season, and so it makes a great break for fire. Ooh, orange jewelweed. So this is, I think, one of the most, I don't know, it's such a cool plant. It looks cool. The name is cool. It's found in cool places, and it's got quite a few benefits. So this is orange jewelweed. It's an annual plant that is about 2 to 5 feet tall. Typically, when I see it, it's about 5 feet tall. I very rarely see very small ones. It seems to just have a ton of rapid growth. And if you were to go up to the stem of this plant and squeeze it, you would feel it very squishy. It's not a robust plant, so this is not a woody plant. This is one of those herbaceous plants, and it's typically found in more wet soil. So a lot of times you're going to find it in riparian areas, so either in floodplains, along rivers, that kind of thing. You can occasionally find it in some of the upland areas, but typically it needs to be an area that has fairly moist soil, for lack of a better term. But it stands out really, really well, especially this time of year. The orange flowers, we just saw one about a week ago when I was out hiking with the wife, and it still had some of these really nice, pretty orange flowers on at this stage. So still nice and showy. This is again another plant that they're going to come. And anytime I find this, one of the areas I hunt, just to step back, is a floodplain riverbed in a piece of Illinois DNR public land. And walking through there, there's a few common plants that I see. One of the big ones is stinging nettle. And the second one is going to be orange jewelweed. Oftentimes you'll kind of find them right next to each other. But anytime I find those two plants, especially in late summer when I'm out scouting, look at the tops of them. And there's areas where I will find where it looks like a 20-foot circle where all the tips, all that new growth has just been browsed and just been nipped right off the top of those plants. And again, orange jewelweed is one you'll readily see, that looks that way. Now there is a sap that's inside of this plant that is supposed to soothe the irritation caused by the urushiol from poison ivy as well as stinging nettle. So like I just mentioned, a lot of times when you find stinging nettle, you're going to find orange jewelweed. So the theory is if you're ever get a reaction from stinging nettle or poison ivy and you start to itch, start to scratch, you can use the sap from the orange jewelweed to help soothe that skin. Fun little factoid. Up next is multiflora rose. So this is a non-native rose. We do have a few rose species in Illinois that are quite prominent on the landscape, but none more prominent than multiflora rose. Again, this is a non-native. It was introduced, but it's pretty much found readily available, and it looks very similar to our native rose species. And the reason I put this version versus our native one is I see more of this on public lands in Illinois than I do any of our native roses. So keep that in mind. If you are interested in trying to identify if it's a multiflora rose versus one of our native, if you look right here at the base of a leaf, you can kind of see these. It's almost a little better to see in this kind of illustrated image up top, but you see all these little hair-like projections at the base of that leaf. So we call that a stipular spine, essentially. It's frayed, right? Our native species, that would be a single structure. It would not have these little wispy looking kind of appendages coming off it. So again, not really super important, but if you're curious, that's kind of what we're looking for is this structure. Native, it would not be frayed like this. It would just be one solid chunk. You wouldn't have all these individual hair-like structures coming off there. But again, this is rose, so we do have both native and non-native. These will have thorns, just like the roses you buy at the store for your spouse or somebody for a special holiday. Can be fairly uncomfortable to walk through, but a couple reasons I want to point this out. Obviously, one, it's a really good food source. But two, if you listened or attended our bedding webinar, you heard us talk about a lot of these thicket areas, particularly if you're in an area that's, let's say, one of these overgrown fields. So it looks like the field is starting to be kind of reclaimed by the forest. Succession is taking over. It's transitioning from a grassland, maybe more into a shrubland. A lot of times you're going to find various rose species in areas like that, intermixed with some of our blackberries, intermixed with some greenbrier species. And they basically make this really nice tangled thicket that not only allows for bedding, but one thing I want to bring up, because obviously we're talking about a feeding webinar here, is very often deer are feeding throughout the day, right? So Curtis just told us how much deer have to feed on kind of a typical day. It's pretty substantial. If they just relied on their feeding activity that they often do in the middle of the night, chances are that wouldn't be enough. And so oftentimes when I'm looking for really productive bedding areas, I'm looking for areas that have a lot of these type plants, whether it's multiflora rose, whether it's greenbrier or some of the blackberries like we'll talk about in a second, really, or even grapevine, really close to those bedding areas. Because very often you'll see the deer get up out of their bed and they'll just kind of mosey around. They'll do like a little 30-yard circle. They'll get up, stretch their legs, go to the bathroom, and then they're going to start just eating a little bit. And so very often I'm looking for productive bedding sites that have a lot of this food really close by. And I like to view it as my hunting spot is more productive, the better the habitat quality. And a lot of times when I'm talking about habitat quality, I'm talking about food and cover. And when you have those two immediately adjacent to each other, it can be very beneficial for us as hunters. So keep an eye out for multiflora rose, greenbrier, blackberry, grapevine, all these different kind of vining plants that we're talking about. Really keep an eye out for them when you're getting close to a bedding area. They can be really productive for that. All right, moving right along to grapevine. So we have several species of grape in Illinois. We have fox grape, we have summer grape. There's even a few that I'm not thinking of at the moment. But a lot of us are probably familiar with this giant looking kind of vining structure here at the bottom that I don't know about you, but every time I'm walking through the woods and I see one, it just makes me want to do the old Tarzan yell and swing on it. But that's grapevine. So anytime you see those giant grapevines, that's grapevine. But obviously, the deer aren't really eating that portion of the plant. What they're eating again is that new young growth. And so oftentimes, the nice thing about the grapevines is they pretty much all the leaves look the same on every grape you're going to see. They all kind of have this similar shape, similar structure. So they're pretty easy to point out once you start to kind of again develop that search image. But again, really, really good food source, commonly found in woodland edges. Again, you're probably starting to pick up on a lot of these plants are what we would consider early successional plants. And if you've taken a lot of our webinars and stuff, you've probably started to hear me use that term quite a bit more recently. And it's important for us as deer hunters to understand that when you watch a lot of these hunting shows, you see them in these beautiful forests that are open, that just are super mature forests, where in reality, deer are very much an early successional species. They really like what we consider a high stem count, right? And so if you're in open woodland, you may only have one stem per cubic yard, one giant tree trunk. In a thicker area, you may have 15, 20, 60, a lot more. And so that's what we're talking about early successional are these thick habitats, and deer really like to thrive in these thick areas. So keep that in mind and keep these vines in mind as you're picking your hunting spots. And here's yet another really good example of this, blackberry. We have a plethora of different blackberry species, raspberry species, again, all really productive food sources. Now, obviously during hunting season, they're not really producing the fruit. They've pretty much already been and done that. But just like all the other plants, they have really nice green, tender, new growth shoots that oftentimes you'll see deer routinely browsing on. But this is another one, especially to pay attention to in some of these more open prairies where we like to talk about a doe family bedding area. Very commonly you'll find blackberries used by those beds. It obviously adds for a little bit more security, but B, again, it adds to that food availability near those beds. And that's something that's really important that I think not a lot of hunters give credit to when they're looking for bedding areas is look at the food abundance in the area. And I started doing this when I started my scouting a few years ago. I started walking through doe bedding areas. Now, I don't do this during the season. I'm doing this in kind of late summer, basically August and September. I will actually walk through a field that I think is a doe bedding area and identify where exactly in those field or where in that field does are bedding. And very commonly, it's going to be areas that are close to a lot of these thickets and these blackberries and all these other vining plants that we talked about. And even if I know we're focused on deer, but these plants that we've just kind of talked about, especially that are prairie focused, so your multiflora rose, your blackberry, some of the greenbrier species, some of the vines, other things like that. Keep an eye out when you're upland hunting too. So many of us, I'm guilty too, when I'm walking through an upland field, very often we like to take the path of least resistance. So a lot of times when we see a little blackberry thicket like that, oftentimes we may okay, I'm just going to walk around it and see, maybe I'll spook something out, maybe not. In reality, chances are that's where a lot of the game species are going to be hanging out, whether it's rabbits, whether it's pheasants, whether it's quail. They really need that structure that's present in an area like this. Obviously, it has food and a little bit more cover than just the typical prairie grasses that are kind of abundant in that area. So even if you're not a deer hunter and you're out pheasant, rabbit, quail hunting, focus on these areas too. All right, now transitioning to a little bit of tree action. So this is what we call the dogwood. So Again, we have several species of dogwood in Illinois. Probably the most common is going to be the flowering dogwood in southern Illinois. The alternate leaf dogwood and swamp dogwood are probably more common in the central/northern part of the state. But this is so we've been talking a lot about shade intolerant trees. The dogwood is very much a shade tolerant species, and so it can really thrive in woodlands. It's what we consider an understory tree. Very easy to identify, one, by the bark. This isn't the best picture of this bark, but the bark is a very small textured bark. So it may look like this is a giant tree from this picture, and that's kind of why I don't really like this particular picture. In reality, that tree is maybe 2 inches in diameter. So we're not talking a big tree. And so just imagine how tiny those individual scales on that can be. There's really not another tree in Illinois and in the Midwest that has bark like that. It produces these berries, which again are readily eaten by wildlife. And obviously in the spring and summer, you'll see these really nice, pretty showy flowers. But one thing that is pretty easy to spot out, and again, this really it starts to develop as you think about trees more when you're out in the woods. You'll start to look at how leaves come off of a tree. And so if you look at the dogwood, every leaf comes off at kind of a vertical angle. So it comes up and has like a tabletop flat. It comes up, tabletop flat, comes up, tabletop flat, where in a lot of trees, leaves are just coming off in every single direction. And you'll really start to develop that search image to the point that this does become, again, one of those 60-mile-per-hour trees just by looking at how the leaves are orientated on that tree, because they're basically all completely horizontal, and they will all come up a little bit off of that stem, and then boom, 2 leaves either side. Again, really easy to ID once you start to develop that search image. Persimmon. So persimmon is a really cool species. This is, again, a native species to the Midwest, native to Illinois. I want you to really focus on this bark here. This is, for me, the dead giveaway. I don't even look at the leaves. The fruit is kind of a dead giveaway too, and we'll get to that in a second, but this bark. A lot of botanists and foresters consider this, what they call it, alligator-like bark. And so if you just look at the back, it kind of looks like the back of an alligator, right? It's just this really coarse, really thick. It's got really deep, what we call deep fissures and kind of fairly elevated ridges. So that bark really does stand out, and you'll see that from a ways off. But the persimmon produces kind of an orange to purple fruit. It's very sweet and edible when it is ripe. And we're getting to the point where deer love persimmon. We found a few persimmon trees a couple weeks ago, and they weren't quite ripe yet, but they're getting there. In some areas of the state, they may be fairly ripe. The easiest way to know if they're ripe is take a very small bite, one, but two, look at the color. But if it is unripe and it is still ripening, it will be the most cotton mouth thing you've ever put in your mouth. It basically instantly takes all the moisture out of your mouth. It doesn't necessarily have a bad taste. It just instant cottonmouth. I remember one of my forestry classes back in the day, our professor, he uses this kind of a rite of passage to identify the persimmon tree. And he talked up this tree. Oh, it's going to be the sweetest fruit you've ever eaten. And he knew none of them were ripe yet, but he wanted to watch all of us squirm. And so he had all of us students grab one, take a big bite, and I tell you, there is nothing that gives cottonmouth like an unripe persimmon, but it's highly attractive to deer. Anytime I see a persimmon tree that's anywhere near where a deer would live, there's pretty much always deer scat underneath it. Now, I do want to emphasize that it's not just deer. Pretty much every species loves a persimmon when it's ripe and when they're falling on the ground, but they are highly attractive to deer. So keep an eye out for those. All right, this is one probably most people are familiar with, poison ivy. So Toxicodendron radicans is the scientific name. And again, the reason I bring that up is this is more closely related to poison sumac, and poison sumac is more related to poison ivy than it is to the normal smooth sumac and staghorn sumac that we talked about a minute ago. Those are completely different families. But this is our poison ivy, leaves of 3, let it be. That's kind of the easiest way to remember it. But since we're at a deer event here, what I really want to talk about is one thing I didn't know as a kid growing up. This is a poison ivy vine. So just like the leaves down below, if you were to come into contact with this vine, it does have the uretiol, which is what causes the itchy reaction that some of us get from interacting with poison ivy. You can get it just from touching this vining structure up the tree. So when you're climbing up a tree with your tree stand, if you ever see A vine that's basically attached to the tree, and it has these hair-like, we call these aerial roots. So these are roots, aerial roots attaching itself to the tree. That's going to be poison ivy. Where if this was a giant grapevine, it would not have those aerial roots. So anytime you see a vine that looks a little, I like to say, hairy, that's probably poison ivy. So keep an eye on that. If you're climbing up a tree and it happens to have poison ivy, you don't want to touch that stuff. It is an excellent food source for deer. They will either come by and eat the entire leaf, which somehow they don't react to it, but they'll also eat the berries. So this does produce a white berry. They will eat that quite regularly. And if you have struggle identifying poison ivy, especially this time of year, it's quite easy because it's one of the first plants that we have that starts to turn red and yellow. And so these leaves will already be turning colors and turning that fall foliage color already. So if you're ever out and you see that's kind of a good indication. Now, there is a related species or a species that a lot of people get confused with poison ivy. It's Virginia creeper, which is another vining-like plant that has leaves that look very similar to this, except it's got 5 leaves per plant instead of the leaves of 3. Let it be. I should emphasize this is a plant that can pretty much grow anywhere. You'll find it like this on trees in the forest. You'll find it along trails in the open woodlands. It likes disturbance. If you disturb an area, it's going to be one of those first pioneer species that pops in there pretty quick. So definitely keep an eye out for that. All right, now we're going to move into some of our hard mast species. So we talked about soft mast a little bit. So that was obviously the persimmon, the crabapple. Those are basically fruiting trees. Now we're going to talk our hard mast or our nut producing trees. So in Illinois, this is arguably one of the most common food sources that most hunters are familiar with, that most hunters are paying attention to, and it's for a good reason. These are oak trees that produce acorns, and that's going to be a staple of the deer diet, particularly during the fall hunting season. As we transition through kind of October and November, this will make up a fairly large portion of their diet. And so I don't want to sit here and go, again, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of different oak species. In reality, as a deer hunter, I like to think of them as 2 groups. And you've probably heard us talk about this quite a lot before, but it's something I think we really need to focus on as hunters is this concept of red versus white oak acorns. And so again, we have a ton of different species, but we can break the oak family into essentially 2 separate groups. We have the erythrobalanis, which is our red oaks, and then we have our leucobalanis oaks, which are our white oaks. So red oaks versus white oaks. Now, where it gets really important is white oaks are our preferred acorns. So the white oaks are typically going to have a sweeter flavor, and that's going to be due to a lower amount of tannic acid or tannins in that acorn. So it's more palatable, it's sweeter, it's not as bitter as the red oaks. Now, there are some disadvantages of the white oaks. One is that lower tannic acid content that allows red oaks to stay on the ground a lot longer and remain viable before they start to rot or germinate. Where a white oak, one, again, they're the preferred, so they're going to get eaten pretty quickly, but 2, they just do not last that long on the forest floor. They just rot a lot quicker, and a lot of it's due to that lower amount of tannic acid. So I say that to say early in fall, basically pretty much, I'm talking almost right now, a lot of the crops are starting to get pulled out of the ground. The corn and soybeans, they're starting to get harvested quite a bit. You're going to start to see the deer start transitioning back to the forest interior, and a lot of times that's what they're going to be feeding on this time of year is these oaks. Now the red oaks, another big advantage is it takes 2 years for an individual red oak acorn to mature. Now, they are still producing acorns every year, but it takes an individual acorn 2 growing seasons before it matures and drops to the ground. Where a white oak, it only takes 1 growing season for that individual acorn to mature. And if you think about that, if you think of years of unfavorable conditions during that growing season, maybe it's a really wet year, or maybe it's a really dry year, maybe it's a drought year, you may not have the abundant white oak crop that you were hoping for. In that case, luckily, the red oaks with that 2-year acorn maturation, they will still have that buffer crop and that buffer growth from that prior growing season. And so you will have some years where you just don't have a very good white oak acorn crop, where the red oaks can kind of fill in and become kind of that supplement. And so I will say this year, it seems like we had just a fine growing season. I was out a couple days ago, and acorns were dropping left, right, and center from everywhere. So this year, it seems like that's not a huge concern, but you will naturally see a shift as the white oak acorns either A, get consumed or start to rot. You'll be sitting in your spot and you go, okay, here they come. Okay, why aren't they here? And maybe you've seen deer feeding on acorns in this area for, every day for a couple weeks, and then all of a sudden it's like a light switch turned and they're not there anymore. You could have spooked them, they could have smelled you, you could have, blown out the area, or maybe they're now switching to a red oak acorn. Maybe all those areas they've consumed all that's available, and so they're going to start to transition to these red oaks. So that's why it's really important to be able to understand these two groups. Now, luckily, it is very easy for us to be able to identify a tree, an oak tree, whether it's in the red oak or the white oak group. And so what we're looking for is these lobes. So this here on the right that I'm kind of highlighting right now is a white oak. And you can see it has these really nice rounded lobes, but look what it doesn't have at the tip of that lobe. If you look at this leaf here on the left, this is a red oak species, and it's got these bristle tips, these hair-like projections all over the ends of those lobes. So that's basically the dead giveaway. If it has those bristle tips, it's a member of the red oak group. If it doesn't, it's a member of the white oak group. Now, I do want to emphasize not every oak leaf looks like this. We have a species that is called shingle oak that looks just like a circle, but it would still have that presence or absence of the bristle tip if it's a red oak, a member of that red oak family. So it doesn't all have to look like your standard oak leaf, but they will still have that bristle tip at the edge if it's a member of the red oak family. But white oak is a staple of my hunting, basically hunting strategy for the first little bit of October, and as we transition, and then I kind of switched to more rut strategies. But finding white oaks is one of the I think best tools you can do as a hunter is finding these white oaks. So we kind of talked a little bit about the importance of them, but what I really want to emphasize, and I wish I had a better picture of it, is they have this very plate-like bark. And now it's not at the base of the tree. Like we've probably all seen shagbark hickory that has this very shaggy bark where the bark is kind of peeling off like old wallpaper starts to do after a while. White oak has that towards the top of the tree. The bottom of the tree will look like your standard just kind of tree bark. But if you were to look up, you would see a lot of that platy bark, and it will be a very whitish, silvery bark, and that's kind of where it gets its name. But I say that to say, after you start to develop the search image of that bark, after a while, you won't even need to look at the leaves. You'll just be walking through the woods. Okay, white oak, white oak, white oak, white oak, white oak, because that bark is so just stand out. Now, one thing that's really nice about oaks is kind of going back to this and looking at the leaves to decide if it's a red versus a member of the white oak group. The nice thing is oaks have very what a lot of us call hardy leaves, and so those leaves will stay on the tree throughout fall. We've probably all been in the woods, and a lot of the maples, oh, those red leaves, they're gone. But if you look at an oak, there's always going to be some of those really old brown leaves that are still up there. And oftentimes I'll just take my pair of binoculars, give them a quick scan. I'll just look like it has a bristle tip. Yes, no, okay, and then I move on. And so you can still use this leaf ID trick even late in the fall, because there will still be some leaves left on that tree. Now, this is one that was not mentioned in some of the scientific reports that Curtis brought up, but this is one plant that we get a lot of questions about. We see it all the time on state land, and it does have some amount of wildlife food value. So this is honey locust. It is a non-native that was brought in Illinois. The dead giveaway when identifying this species is look at these gnarly spines, thorns. I don't even know what you call these, spears. Like they are just ginormous coming off this thing, and it will be throughout the entire tree. The bark will be covered in them, the trunk, the branches, everything will be covered in these big spines. Now, there has been some effort horticulturally. They have developed a honey locust species of tree that does not have these spines. So if you're ever in a park and you happen to see the rest of your ID characteristics, but it doesn't have all these spines and thorns, it very well could be one of those cultivars that they developed to not have these spines. But out in the wild, that's what you're going to see. But what I want to point out is this long seed pod. And so these seed pods can be huge. I'm talking like 18 to 24 inches in length. They can be really, really long, and it looks like just your standard bean pod. You've probably seen them on the ground when you're out walking around. And you're like, oh, what the heck is that? That's honey locust. What I want to emphasize is it's not a huge food source for deer, but like Curtis said, when we looked at some of those numbers a little bit ago, 93% of the diet is made up by like a third of the plants or something. Well, this is one of those that doesn't get a lot of attention, but I like to focus on it, particularly in the late portion of the season. As a lot of the other food has been consumed, you will start to see deer transition to actually now feeding on these honey locust seed pods. Again, it's not a desirable food. If white oaks are around, if corn's around, if soybean, they're probably going to go for those other options. But you will find areas, especially in that late season after Christmas, moving into mid-January when the archery season closes, you will find deer consuming these seed pods because again, it's one of the last few food sources that's actually still out there on the landscape. So keep an eye out for that. Again, if I see them, I just kind of make mental notes of them, and hey, maybe I'll come back here in late season and see if there's active feeding in this area, and then maybe it's worth sitting on. But I'm not going to hunt it obviously in October, November, but it could be really productive for a late season. But that's about all I have. So Curtis, if you want to kind of come back and we'll answer any questions if we have any.
Let's see.
Doesn't look like we have anything yet. Cool. That's good. It's a good problem to have. It means we either did really good or really bad. But I think this is kind of a perfect way to sum up, and we'll give it a few minutes, and then we'll kind of get out of here. But if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll address those. But again, I really want to emphasize that a lot of us as hunters view the feeding area as this big, giant, open field that all the deer are flocking to, like on the TV shows or you see just driving down the county park. In reality, that's not where a lot of deer feeding occurs. A lot of that feeding is going to occur pretty close to some of that bedding. So be on the lookout for those vining plants. You don't always have to think of this pattern as this bed to feed pattern, right? There can be feeding areas near the bedding, but they're kind of a supplement to their main food source that they may use throughout the night. So whenever I'm looking at bedding areas, I'm always looking if there's high quality browse or if there's high quality food readily available within, like, let's say a 50-yard radius of that bedding area. You're going to find a lot more deer bedding in areas like that where they can just stand up, stretch their legs, go to the bathroom a little bit, browse a little bit, 10, 15 minutes, and then lay back down.
And one thing I like to throw in there is make your own observations when you're out hunting too. If you see a deer walking and it starts eating something, make a note for that. And at the end of your hunt, maybe you walk over there and be like, "What was it eating on?" And you should be able to see which plants are browsed on. And if you can't ID it, take a picture. Now, you've got apps you can download that will, with some degree of certainty, ID most of the plants that are out there for you. All you need is a picture to do that, and you can start keeping track of what plants the deer are eating at your particular place. Because this could change. I'm sure if they would have done this 100 years ago, something like chestnuts would have
Oh
been
yeah, yeah.
really high value for deer. But guess what? We don't have many of them left. They love chestnuts, but they're hard to find. So, but if you just happen to hunt on a place that has a little chestnut orchard out there, then maybe the deer fill it up on chestnuts. You never know. But definitely take your own observations and take that to heart, because deer are going to eat the best plants in the location where you're at, which may vary from spot to spot.
Absolutely. They're very optimistic feeders too. That's I think one thing that we've put some emphasis throughout this kind of webinar and a lot of our other conversations, but deer are very optimistic feeders. So a lot of times if it's a plant that they readily eat and it's easily accessible, they're going to eat it.
For sure, yes, but always it's this early successional, the
Yep.
disturbance, that's where they're hanging out, that's where they're spending most of their time. Not that they don't use the mature forest at all, but if you got a chance, hunt the thick stuff, hunt the viney, the stuff you don't want to walk through. That's where the deer are going to be spending 90% of their time. Those open forests are great for turkeys. Turkeys
Yeah.
love 'em. Deer, not so much.
But they're beautiful to walk through. Yep. But you've heard us talk. If you took our bedding webinar, you heard us emphasize the whole concept of a south-facing slope. So the south faces of slopes get more solar radiation throughout the day, which again leads to not only it being generally a little bit warmer, but it leads to higher stem count. It leads to more plant diversity, and so all this starts to come together and paints a picture that understanding plants is really important for us as deer hunters. And I think a lot of deer hunters don't give a lot of emphasis to it, but I think it can be really valuable for us to identify not only bedding, but also some of these feeding areas. So definitely keep that in mind.
And this is one of the big reasons why everybody's going to native plants, because diversity is key when it comes to wildlife habitat for anything, whether it's deer, pollinators, you name it. And the bad thing, or one of the worst things that these invasive plants do, is they take over an area. We've all seen it, where you walk into a woodlot or a grassland and it's just a monoculture of one single species. That's almost always an invasive species. So removing that and getting a diverse array of different plants is going to be better for everything.
Absolutely. And that's just to, I'll kind of close it out since we haven't got any questions yet. But if you have any questions after we close out, feel free to shoot us an email, message us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, whatever. We're happy to answer. But you hear us talk a lot about deer and not just deer, but other game species, most game species, in fact, being what we consider an edge species. So these are basically the intersection between two habitat types, whether it's a mature forest to a young forest to a prairie to a shrubland. They really like where two habitat types come together. And Curtis just basically summed up why that's the case. It's plant diversity, right? And so when you have these two habitat types coming together, you have more plant diversity just from I've got plants that prefer this habitat on the left, and I have plants that prefer this habitat on the right. And so that's we get a lot of questions about, well, why are deer edge species? That's one of the biggest things is just plant diversity. Well, anything to add, Curtis? If not, we'll kind of close it out. But thanks for coming, everybody. This recording will be thrown up on YouTube here shortly. And so if you missed it or you had to take off early or just kind of want to rekindle, listen to my beautiful voice a little bit more, we'll get that recording up here shortly.
Yeah, and watch out. We've got a rut strategic webinar that's coming up tomorrow. So if you haven't yet registered for that, definitely get into that. Still got space. And then if you're up in the Vernon Hills area and you want to do something in person and also get to try some wild game, we've got a workshop coming up, our first ever at the Sitka store at Vernon Hills, where we're going to be diving into everything rut and trying some wild game. And you're not going to want to miss that one if you're around Vernon Hills. That's going to be Friday the 17th.
Awesome. Yep, that's going to be a lot of fun. Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody, and hope to see you out in the field. Good luck and safe hunting this season.
See ya.